Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. It's going to be so lovely to see so many faces. I'm going to hand over to the panel very shortly and over to Zoe, who is our chair for this afternoon, to talk us through and introduce the event properly. But for now, my name's Jessie Wild, and I am just wanting to give you a brief introduction to say hello and welcome to the Bristol Housing Festival. If you're not aware, this event is part of a lineup of 3 weeks of events that we have going on as part of the annual expo for the Bristol Housing Festival this year. Everything this year has gone virtual due to current circumstances, so you will be able to watch anything that you've missed on our YouTube channel. So if you go to Bristol Housing Festival's website, you can have a link through to the YouTube channel from there, or you can just search for us on there. You'll find all the webinars that we've held so far are there recorded, and you can watch them back, along with, as well as that, our one-to-one interview series that we have done with a number of different people for this virtual expo. But today, this is the third of 3 webinars that we've hosted today, and I am very nearly about to hand over to Zoe, who will be chairing this event, Levelling Up Access to Green Spaces. So thank you so much for joining us. We're delighted to be putting this on, and thank you so much to the panel who are here and ready to answer any questions. So if you do have any questions as we go through, do make sure you put them through in the Q&A box below. But I'm just waiting for a few more people to come through the virtual doors, as it were. So just to say thank you so much for coming. This is one of the events of the Bristol Housing Festival Virtual Expo 2020. Zoe Metcalf, who is chairing this event, can I hand over to you? Thank you so much, Zoe. Enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Jessie. Thank you ever so much. And thank you to the Bristol Housing Festival for creating this forum that enables us to have this panel of distinguished experts with us here today, who are not only knowledgeable in their field, but they're actually making things happen. Our intention today is to hold a conversation for about 45 minutes, which will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. You'll find your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It's the little bubble speakers sign. So do click on that and pop any questions in that you'd like to ask the panel at the end of the session. I will give you a prompt a little bit later. So we're really looking forward to hearing from the panel about the importance and value in levelling up access to green space. And before I introduce them, I just wanted to set a little bit of context. We're all too aware that the period of lockdown has been associated with physical and mental health risks to those confined to their homes. And these disproportionately affect the mental and physical health of those from more disadvantaged communities and those who live alone in overcrowded accommodation without access to gardens, balconies, or green space. I just wanted to focus on some of the findings relating to England from the National Statistics Population in May earlier this year, which found that 1 in 8 British households has no garden. And the percentage of homes without a garden is higher among ethnic minorities, with Black people in England nearly 4 times as likely as white people to have no outdoor space at home. Access to high quality green space is not equally driven, with disadvantaged communities having significantly less access, not only in their own gardens or other outside space, but also to green space within 300 metres of their home. The Office of National Statistics compared the likelihood for people of white ethnicity to not have a garden with those of other ethnicities. The odds ratios indicates that people of Black, other Asian and mixed ethnicities are less likely to have access to a garden compared with people of white ethnicity. And when looking at the age ratios, younger people aged between 16 and 24 and 25 to 34 years are consistently less likely to have access to a garden than those aged 65 years and over. Those living in urban major conurbation areas and urban cities and towns are less likely to have access to a garden, while those living in rural towns and fringe sparse setting areas are more likely to have access to a garden. And when you look at this in relation to Bristol, you can map the difference between dwellings without access to garden, and there's quite a discrepancy. So if you look at Clifton, Hotwells and Bedminster, for instance, those neighbourhood dwellings without access to a garden ranges from 19 to 28% of the population. When you take a lens of focus for central Bristol, the neighbourhoods of Temple Meads and the city centre for dwellings without a garden is at 62 to 64%. The other thing I want to emphasise is that physical access is not the only barrier to accessing green space. Cultural barriers, and a lack of a sense of connection plays a significant part. The Nature Connectedness Research Group was the first to focus on the area of nature connectedness, which was a partnership with Natural England, National Trust, the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust and a number of other nature conservation NGOs. This pioneering work looked at people's sense of their relationship with the natural world with the aim to bring about association benefits in well-being and conservation behaviour, coining the phrase, "There's no well-being without nature's well-being." All of the above sits against a backdrop of a climate and ecological emergency, and Bristol being the first major UK city to declare an ecological emergency in response to escalating threats to wildlife and ecosystems. It builds on the declaration of a climate emergency in 2018 and recognises that these two threats to our well-being, with the hope that will kickstart a response from the whole city. The West of England Nature Partnership introduced a nature recovery network for the West of England in 2018, a joined up network of marine and terrestrial habitats where nature and people can thrive. So today we're going to learn more about the ecological and biodiversity challenges here in our region, the activities in progress to level up access to green space and nature connection, the need and scale of ambition and why levelling up access to and valuing green space matters in our neighbours, and why do residential providers, housing developers, MMC providers, city and regional stakeholders and community-led initiatives who hold the power to change need to take note. So without further ado, let's go over to the panel, and I'm going to start with asking Selina to introduce herself, please.
Hi, I'm Selina Gray. I'm the chair of the West of England Nature Partnership, and I'm a Professor of Public Health at UE Bristol.
Thanks, Selina, and over to Ian. Ian, you're on mute.
Somebody had to do it. Hi, I'm Ian Barrett. I'm the Chief Executive of Avon Wildlife Trust.
Great, thanks Ian. And Savita?
Hi, I'm Savita. I'm Director of the Natural History Consortium, which is a collaboration of 13 regional and national organisations.
Fabulous. And Kim?
Hi, I'm Kim Taylor. I'm the Manager for the Environmental and Landscape Services for the whole of Plymouth Community Homes.
And to Ross?
Hi, I'm Ross Kennelly. I'm Regional Director for the Woodland Trust, which is a charity committed to the UK rich in native woods and trees for people and for nature.
Thanks, Ross. And then last but not least, to Ben.
Hi, I'm Ben Barker. I'm a community activist and I'm the Secretary of the BS3 Wildlife Group.
Thank you. So we're going to start our conversation with Selina and Ian, who are both going to talk about why green space matters. So Selina.
So thank you, Zoe. I think if we didn't realise it before lockdown, we certainly realise it now. Having access to green space, green and blue space, rivers and the coast is really good for your mental and for your physical health. There are numerous studies which show that those people with more access, living closer to green spaces, are healthier, both physically, they do more physical activity, and mentally. As Zoe has already mentioned, an important part of that benefit comes through feeling connected to those local spaces and to the nature in those local spaces, and learning how to really appreciate and understand the spaces that we're using. There is some really interesting emerging evidence that actually it's not just about your mind, that actually being exposed to more varied, green, diverse environments can actually affect your the flora, microbiological flora in your gut and on your skin, and actually have an impact on your immune systems, making you literally more healthy and more able to fight infection. There's evidence that growing food, growing vegetables, growing plants also has a very positive effect on your mental health. I personally was really interested to spend so much time very locally during lockdown in my garden in the immediate locality, and realised, I remember the thrill one day when I found a devil's coach horse beetle in my garden, which, you know, is like a scorpion. And it was amazing to not have to go anywhere to find such exotic mini beasts. So there's a really strong emerging evidence base about this. We do need to provide green spaces close to where people live. We need to help people know that they're there and understand how to use them best. We need spaces for people to grow, whether it's a window box, a balcony, a community orchard, or a community farm. These things are really important. So WEMP is a partnership of local authorities, WECA, the water companies, key NGOs, many of the people involved in the webinar today. And we are really working hard to try and get nature into health, working with our health partners, trying to encourage green space in the planning process. And as you already mentioned, to get this nature recovery network across the west of England really functioning well. So I think that's enough introductory remarks from me. Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks, Selina. And I love your moment of delight with the Devil's Coach House beetle. Thank you for that. Just briefly, Selina, what kind of scale are you looking at in terms of the Nature Recovery Partnership from a geographic perspective?
Sorry, this is the west of England. So it's Bath, North Somerset, South Gloucester and Bristol City Council. So it's the whole of the WECA, West of England Combined Authority area. But it's very important to note that the Nature Recovery Network, of course, joins up with areas outside of the west of England. So the links to the Cotswold, the links to Wiltshire, the links to Somerset, and in particular, the fabulous Severn Estuary, which runs through our patch. So we're very much looking at how we link outside to other parts of England and Wales.
Great, thank you, Selina. Ian.
Hi. So, sorry, I've just lost my notes. So those of you who have seen any of the David Attenborough programs recently, like Extinction: The Facts, will know that we are facing an absolutely massive decline in wildlife at the moment, and that has big implications for people and people's health. So we know now that we've lost 68% of species since the 1970s globally. That's right the way through from vertebrates like elephants and tigers and lions and all the things you see on the documentaries through to insects and things in our rivers. And that's a massive global issue. It's also a national issue. In the UK, we've lost 44 million songbirds since the 1960s. We've lost 30 million hedgehogs. That's 95% of our hedgehogs since the 1950s. And it's a local issue as well. So in Bristol, the bird monitoring that the Bristol naturalists have done have shown we've lost 96% of our swifts and starlings since 1994. So that's, you know, in a relatively short amount of time. We know that insects are in trouble worldwide in places as far apart as Germany and Puerto Rico with completely different types of environment. They've lost 75% of their insects over that same kind of time period. And that matters because insects are the basis of the food web that everything else relies on. We don't have the same figures for insects in the UK, but if we look at insect-eating birds like nightingale and spotted flycatchers, we've lost over 90% of those animals. So we're losing species 100 to 1,000 times faster than we would do naturally. 1 in 8 bird species is threatened with global extinction, 41% of our insects, 15% of species in the UK. I could carry on reeling off statistics, but I know that doesn't really help. And the most shocking one I've heard recently is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year said that if the temperature rises by 1.5 degrees, we could lose 20 to 30% of species on the planet. And that's, you know, 1.5 is what we're aiming to achieve, and it could be a lot worse than that. So it's not an exaggeration to say our wildlife really is in massive trouble. And that matters not just for people who like watching David Attenborough documentaries, people who like watching wildlife. It matters to all of us because wildlife ecosystems are what make up the planetary life support systems. They give us clean air, clean water, they regulate the climate. 75% of the foods we eat are pollinated by insects. So whether you care about wildlife or whether you don't, this is not an optional extra. This matters to everybody. We cannot live as we're living now without healthy ecosystems underpinning us. It's just as important as the climate. So that's one of the reasons, or a series of the reasons why Bristol was the first major city in the UK to declare an ecological emergency. We've recognised as a city, as organisations within the city, with the council and others, that we need to do something about this, that we've, similarly to climate change, we've got about 10 years really to seriously turn things around. It's not too late to act now, but we do need to act now. So the ecological emergency strategy we produced a couple of weeks ago has got a series of targets in it. 30% of the city being managed for nature by 2030, 50% reduction in pesticide use to help out those insects, cleaning up the microplastics and the pharmaceuticals that are now causing pollution in our rivers, and looking at our global footprint. So the things that we buy as individuals, the supply chains of organizations are not impacting on ecosystems globally in places like the Amazon, Borneo, and all of those places. So we've set out a series of things that we need to do, but there's also some principles that underpin that strategy. And the three words we use to sum that up are fair, just, and inclusive, because we need to make sure not only that everybody has the opportunity to join in with the action tackling the ecological emergency, but also that everybody enjoys the benefits of a healthy natural environment. And that fits really strongly with the whole theme of levelling up access to green space from this webinar. So this is the Bristol Housing Festival. So what does that mean in terms of housing? Well, we've got a housing crisis in Bristol. We've got lots of houses that are going to be built. We've got a climate crisis. We know we need to build zero carbon housing and completely change the housing stock. So we've got an opportunity over the next 10, 20 years to redesign, rebuild the city and look at how we're doing things. And we need to make sure that when we're doing that, we're building in nature and ecosystems. So we need to make sure we've got plenty of green space and that is wildlife friendly. We need to make sure we've got wildlife corridors so that animals aren't isolated, because isolated wildlife populations don't survive. We need to make sure we've got those hedgehog corridors and things. So Selina's already mentioned the Nature Recovery Network, which goes all the way across Bristol, Bath City region and across the whole country. That comes into the city as well. So we need to work out where those connections are that allow wildlife to survive and thrive. So it's about new housing, it's about how well that's built. It's also about our existing housing, how we make sure we've got the spaces for bats, birds in our roofs, that we've got gardens full of wildflowers, that we've got those spaces where wildlife can thrive. So there's a series of tools to help us with that. The Building with Nature tool that Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust have developed gives us a series of benchmark standards on how you can design neighbourhoods to be good for well-being, for water and for wildlife. So we need to take advantage of the opportunities we've got over the next 20 years to redesign our city to really work for people and wildlife, make it easy for people to get access, make it easy for people to do the right thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, and some startling numbers there. And certainly I reflect back to 30 years ago when you used to drive in the car up the M4 and you'd get somewhere and your car would absolutely be plastered with insects and you'd struggle to get them off. And now your windscreen is pretty clean wherever you go, which is just devastating. And I truly think that the Bristol strategy now and the ecological emergency and the interventions you mentioned are a real catalyst to that urgent need. I mean, 10 years is no time at all to make that change. So thanks, Ian. I'm now going to move to Savita.
I'm on mute as well. Thank you so much for having me. As I mentioned, I run the Natural History Consortium, which is a collaboration of organizations who work together to find new ways of connecting people with nature and the environment. And it was an interesting year to be doing that with lockdown. We had a big event planned in April called City Nature Challenge, where Bristol was set to compete against over 200 cities across the UK and the world to do some wildlife recording. So to go out and find species of all kinds, take some photographs and help to collect a bit of a catalogue of species in the region. But of course, being under lockdown, we had to change our plans pretty rapidly. Working from home and being one of those 62% of people without a garden in the centre of Bristol, I was running this event from my flat. But what we found is that people were absolutely up for the challenge. And there was lots of ways to connect people and the environment during that time. We had people taking photographs of spiders in their house and finding things on their balcony, or using their 1 hour of exercise a day to find a local green space. All in all, over 9,000 people in Bristol took photographs and submitted them over 4 days. And we also had a huge response from the social media community. Lots of Instagram influencers who maybe couldn't be off on their lovely holidays suddenly started visiting their local parks. And we had a huge amount of interest and connections. But I think it all comes down really to individual actions and working on the ecological emergency. There's a real thread of taking action now. One of the things that I keep hearing from people is the need to be really clear about how our individual actions connect into a larger narrative. It's why things like the Nature Recovery Network are so important, so that we can see what I'm doing here in my patch connects into a wildlife corridor or a bigger strategy for the region. There's a really important communication and engagement challenge there. And I think the other one, we're all sitting here as part of this event with our professional hats on, is really helping to build agency for change through people's professional roles. We all wear multiple hats throughout the day and throughout the week. And sometimes we tend to separate them by saying, well, we need to engage people here and we need to engage businesses here, when all of us are both professional and personal in a week. So I think that's a real opportunity. It's a great opportunity to connect both some of the people working on the nature space with people working on the housing space. And I think there's a lot more that we can do over the next year.
Thanks, Savita. That's really interesting. One of the things that comes to mind hearing you speak is the love of nature, and clearly you had 9,000 individuals in Bristol who have a love or are falling in love with nature and having that connection, which seems to be really key from the Nature Connectedness findings in developing a long-term role in conservation. One of the things that's apparent though is that, for those from disadvantaged communities or from the BAME community, that connection is perhaps not present. Either there is no nature on their doorstep, or just the cultural access and having that opportunity purposely to connect. I mean, what are your thoughts around what we could do, particularly in this time of pandemic, to perhaps mobilise individuals and families?
Well, I think part of what we need to do is give more awareness to some of the green spaces that actually are, if not on your doorstep, close by. And I think lockdown was quite powerful for that. There was a lot on social media of people saying, oh, I didn't realize this was just down the road, or I didn't realize I had access to this space. Or as I said, people, connecting with the nature they could either see from their window or even, find inside their house. That's a bit of, hopefully not all the time. So I think, that's one opportunity, and also a lot of the work that's being done with schools and community groups. So thinking about the ways that people come together and the way that we can bring nature into some of those groups and conversations in different ways. We don't have to always do this kind of household by household.
Great, thanks. Now, Kim, I know you're going to bring some of this to life for me, real time, with the work that you've been doing with Plymouth Community Homes. So over to you.
Hi, thank you for inviting me along. I can tell you that having worked with many areas of Plymouth in what are many deprived areas, you get to see an awful lot of people from many, many different backgrounds. And one of the ways of looking at your community is see how long they're sustained for. And when you've got a floating community that keeps moving in and out, it's not succeeding, and you end up with a lot of isolation. To give you an example, you've got people coming in from every walk of life and from all over the world. So you've got people who have got language barriers, people who have got lifestyle barriers. To give an example of some of the people I've dealt with, we had one man who was a very professional worker, lived in a very nice part of town, fell into gambling and drug abuse. He lost his income, he lost everything, which meant his self-esteem was extremely low and he had nowhere to go, didn't know how to talk to the people around him. Another lady came out of being a naval officer's wife, came on hard times. Her children had gone to a private schooling and had to adapt to living in social housing, but her misunderstanding about people in the area that she was living in, when that she left herself being isolated. There are lots and lots of different stories I can tell you like that, but there's people who just live in blocks and blocks of houses, never even get to know their neighbour, live there for 10 years and don't know any of their neighbours. But by looking at the green spaces you have outside and knowing that putting swathes of grass is not, it's not conducive to anything, but having people come forward and say, can we create a garden, is the best thing that you can have happen. So encouraging that is what we've done across the city in lots of places. And by doing that, what you do is you invite them all to come out and have a look at the area that they've got, bring them to events and ask them what they want to do with that ground. Don't tell them, ask them, because they're much more likely to get on board. And once they all start working, they become quite excited. They think about growing vegetables. They look at wildflower bombs to encourage bees. But there's lots of different things that they can do. And if you think, we had one lady who had she was very lonely and she drank an awful lot and there wasn't much else that she did with her life. But she used to be a keen gardener, but she now lived in a block of flats, no garden, nothing. She got involved in the garden project and practically runs it now. And instead of going out drinking, every time she comes out the property, she sees her garden and she works on the garden. And her lifestyle has transformed. So she's now growing and eating the vegetables that she's growing. She's developing the garden. But on top of that, she's also talking to those other people who are isolated. And so all those different people come together. And we've had communities where we've got parents that barely speak English and it's their 6-year-old child that's translating for their parents, but those parents have come out and started to introduce other vegetables from their world to grow so that they can eat vegetables that they're used to from their own countries from before. And it's a lovely thing to see that develop and happen. And we've seen that created along the way. At the back of one area, we had a huge swathe of grass on the back of a railway line, which we've actually developed into a small woodland, planted loads and loads of trees all the way down it. But all the community got involved, including the children, and they all had trees named after them, adopted those trees, and they would water them and nurture them and make sure that they grew into fruition. And now it's a lovely place to walk through with a really nice walkway, and that also has wildflower planting, and it's developed beautifully. And it's something, it's a joy to see it. And other areas where we regenerated a big area of North Prospect, which had gone into a lot of decline, but by regenerating it, we have developed things like hedgehog passes. So where everywhere we've developed, we've made sure that the bats and the hedgehogs and everybody else is involved. But instead of putting loads and loads of grass areas down, we've developed planters near each person's home so that they can develop those planters too. So there's lots of different things that we have done to sort of encourage that. And coming into this year, sadly, was supposed to be our Mayflower celebrations. It hasn't quite got off the ground, but we are still trying to push it through, and we will carry on next year. And we've got some people who have developed this massive Mayflower ship that we're going to be erecting and putting loads and loads of plants from it. And that is a gateway to the Mayflower steps into the Barbican. In the last year, we've got more involved, which I'm sure Ross can tell you more about, where we've developed a full partnership with all the different partners who are involved in creating a greater canopy across Plymouth. And one of the new areas that have been built out of town has got an avenue that you can cycle all the way into the city. And the idea is that all the different partners talk to each other, make sure we're planting the right trees, but create an avenue from that town all the way through into the city for anybody to walk or cycle through. And it's something you couldn't do if we all work separately. By working together, we all make sure that we all follow that path and we all keep it running. So it's been a huge success. And we do continue to encourage people to do more. And even through the COVID period, that's the one thing we've managed to do, because you can garden and social distance at the same time. So they've still been able to get out of their houses and still be able to keep those gardens going. And it's the biggest thing we've tried to do is make sure that they can grow their own vegetables or their own plants, but also engaging community, talking with each other. It's been a good turnaround.
I mean, wonderful interventions there, Kim. Amazing. And one of the things that really strikes me is that there's quite a tension quite often with potentially residential providers who have a management role over an estate or area of social housing. Yeah. What have you seen as the benefits for you organisationally by making those interventions?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, we all know that councils it was so much easier to have swathes and swathes of grass and just run the mowers over it. It's very quick and simple to do that. But in actual fact, instead of having loads and loads of grass cutters, I've actually employed some people to actually be the people who go around to the planters and the bedding areas and offer support and advice to the residents so they know what they're doing, and that we can get there and do a bit of weeding and help with some of the work that they're doing, because it's all a learning curve. Some people are starting from scratch with no knowledge of what they're doing. So in many ways, it's not cost us anymore by doing that. We've just changed what we're spending our money on. And what we are doing, it means that we've got much more sustainable tenancies. And by doing that, you haven't got such a turnaround of properties that doesn't cost so much. Turning around properties is the most expensive thing for any social housing.
Absolutely.
So it makes sense to make that community work, because a happy community will stay where it is and it will thrive, and it will reduce your antisocial behaviour and your graffiti and everything else. If they're on board working on that ground, they won't destroy it.
Fabulous. Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks, Kim. Fantastic. So Ross, build on that. Some great successes in Plymouth. I know you've been part of the story, but
he has.
Yeah. No, thank you, Zoe, and good afternoon to you all there. And we're talking to a housing audience here, so across that sector. And I think the first thing I'd say is, Kim makes the case brilliantly there, but green space isn't a nice to have in urban areas. It's an absolute need to have. And I think that's something that increasingly we all need to embrace and come together over. And the idea of partnership, I think, is a really strong one. I think you'll find now amongst the development sector, the local authority sector, that you'll find very willing partners in your communities and your charity sector to want to work on this. And the benefits have really come through this year. And I'm just going to very quickly divert to a very short article, picks up on something Selena said that I read at lunchtime. Forest play boosts immune systems in children. Children whose outdoor play areas were transformed from gravel yards to mini forests showed improved immune systems within a month. Not peer-reviewed, Selena, but very clearly from some research in Finland, where those, it's actually microbes on the skin and in the gut. So this isn't just some sort of theoretical discussion around whether green space is good for you and how you perceive it, but it's actually physically good for you. So I think I could do a little bit of plug as a Woodland Trust representative about why woodlands are particularly good and a particularly robust foundation for those new green spaces, including the fact, they're good for nature, good for people, good for carbon. But actually, for those of you who are designing green spaces within public realm, and I suppose trying to retrospectively create high quality placemaking in existing cities, trees and woodlands really do give that beautiful framework and a scale that probably some of the other elements of public space don't give. So I suppose that's the plug for the Woodland Trust at the start. I think it's also important to think really about that access and that equality to the access. And Zoe mentioned it in the introduction. But there are clear standards. They're not nationally mandated standards, but there are clear standards about access to green space. And Bristol actually, just looking at the figures, comes out reasonably well in terms of access to woodlands. It's pretty much at the national par with about, and the standard there is how many people can get to a wood within 500 metres of an easy walk. And in Bristol, that's about 18%. In North Somerset, that's slightly lower. South Gloucestershire, it's about 20%. Bath, it's nearly 30%. And if you can think about those places where you do have that good access, you also feel about where you get that quality of life that really drives and brings community together, pretty much as Kim has expressed there. just quickly talk about a couple of examples. Could have picked Bristol. I'll follow on with Plymouth, but it's actually where you need to work from the policy level. So actually get those policies into the local plan, into the strategic plans, about the levels of provision for public space and green space. And I think from a Woodland Trust perspective, and I suppose my own professional work in this over the years, you need the quantity, but you do need the quality as well. So as Kim has said, a poor quality public space does very little for community nature. A high quality public space, and one with good access, so safe routes, clear routes, and good access at the threshold to those sites so people feel welcomed, is really important. And you can build those in easily to new development, but you can also retrospectively create those within urban regeneration. And I think from a housing perspective, that's something that really needs to have a focus. So I suppose the example in Plymouth, there's a Plymouth plan for trees, it's got policy, it's got delivery, and it's got those quality and accessibility standards in there. We've moved into partnership, we're doing delivery. It's great to work across the building sector, the development sector, and with the community homes on new spaces for people. And in terms of partnership, I'll also just quickly talk about, from charity point of view, work the Woodland Trust does, joint purchases with the National Trust on woodlands, and creating those as public spaces. And the real challenge there is it's relatively easy in rural areas, relatively. It's very difficult in urban and urban fringe areas. So that's where we need the engagement of the development sector and the housing sector. I think there's a wide, willing partnership to come in on creating quality urban areas and open out to those discussions early, because I think we can there to assist, we can bring in voluntary support, we can build those communities and memberships and a real love of those spaces when they come forward. I'll just close, Zoe, very quickly by saying, whilst we have very strong and strict rules on grey infrastructure and road networks and sewerage and all the basic hard stuff, green infrastructure is a real poor relation. So those green spaces are left. They're not mandatory, they're discretionary. Councils own them, charities own them, housing associations own them. Developers often retain them or put them in management companies, and utilities own them. It's a really dispersed ownership and management. And I think that as a challenge to the housing sector is how do you bring the management of that together and create a common cause around high quality, high accessible green space. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. And I think that ask around, yeah, how do we get that? How do we aggregate land? How do we make better use of it? Is a really interesting one. And perhaps part of the answer lies in communities understanding their capacity as well of what can they do, because it's very clear this is not about local authorities having to carry the burden of this. This is about community engagement and benefiting from the mental and health and well-being benefits, but then better understand what's their capacity, how could they be involved, and creating that partnership environment is a fantastic opportunity. So thanks very much, Ross. Ben, I'm now going to move to you. You've been on the grounds leading community engagement around rewilding and gardening for some time. So do share your story, Ross. Ben, sorry.
Okay. The BSC Wildlife Group has been around for a while, but we relaunched it in 2017. And at that time, we adopted actually the Avon Wildlife Trust My Wild City objectives of raising local people's awareness of wildlife and also doing what we can to improve habitat. That's built up quite steadily over the last 3 or 4 years. One of the ways in which we've been doing that, obviously, is to relate very much to individuals with gardens. Lots of people do wildlife gardening because they enjoy it. But what we're trying to do is to link those people up so that they can share ideas, so they can show each other what they're doing, and so on. So it's not a solitary hobby, as it were, but they feel that they're making a wider contribution in an area of the city which is actually not awfully conducive to wildlife. For those of you that are familiar with the BS3 area, with Bedminster, it's a highly congested Victorian neighbourhood, deluged in cars, lots of air pollution. You know, if you were a wildlife, if you were a pigeon, you would want to go somewhere else probably. But we're encouraging all those things to improve. Amongst the sorts of things that we've started to do was, as I say, firstly to encourage wildlife gardening, but also to start people looking at particular species. We started off in 2017 by asking our contacts if they could answer the question, how many species of butterfly can you find in BS3? And only a few people responded, but we began to get some answers. And we're now actually in the process of writing up our 4th report. And it looks as if the answer to the question, how many species of butterflies, it looks at the moment as if it's going to be 19 for 2020. But watch this space, it could be 21, you never know. So we're beginning to raise people's awareness by getting them to just look and not just notice as they might well have done in the past, but to record the fact that they've noticed and then share it with other people. And we started off with a pretty small group, and it's still pretty small, but it's bigger than it was, and we think we'll get more and more. We're also doing monitoring birds over winter. We found a few people with moth traps, so we're monitoring moths. I'm hoping this year, my fingers are crossed, that we're going to do our first how many dragonflies live in BS3. So we're beginning to build that up. One of the other things we've done is to audit the spaces that are in BS3. Obviously, there are a number of parks, and as has been said, they're very good at what the council calls amenity grass, which is basically short, boring, useless grass. Unless if you want to play football, it's fine. But if you're a cricket, it's not much good. So we contacted the local parks, the local allotment people. We have a city farm in the area, and there are other green spaces, and said, are you doing anything about wildlife? Obviously, some of them are very keen on improving kids' playgrounds, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But we're encouraging all of those green spaces to think about what are there things that we can do to encourage wildlife. And so that was an important audit for us. And one of the other things we've done locally is, with the help of a student, is to begin to encourage people to develop walks. So we've got a tree walk, for example, along the Malago, which was part of someone's a master's degree. So yeah, it's all good stuff, really. So those are the sorts of things we're doing. At the beginning of 2020, we decided we'd expand. So we started to contact people in other parts of South Bristol, and we called that bit of the project My Wild South Bristol. And we've now got an audit, which has started at least, looking at BS4, BS13 and BS14. We're working with some officers from Avon Wildlife Trust to develop that. I'm currently in discussion with 3 students from UWE to look at My Wild North Bristol. And what I'm hoping is that they will take 1 or 2 postal districts in the north and start to do what we started to do in 2017 and gradually build that up. So those are the sorts of things we're doing. In terms of barriers, which one of the things you mentioned you'd like me to talk about, I want to mention 2. One barrier is about shyness or coyness, if you like, where people feel that it's someone else has to do these things, not them. And so we try and talk people through that. People say, for example, well, it's no good me monitoring butterflies because I don't know one from the other. So we basically point out that the greatest expert in butterflies in the entire world, once upon a time, didn't know one butterfly from another. That's the natural human condition when you start something. So we're beginning to build up people's confidence in that sort of way. One of the other things I think, which is a barrier, is funding. We're lucky enough not to have any funding. All the things we've done have been without cost to anybody else. And that gives an immense resilience to a community-based organisation. We're not thinking in terms of, oh, we've got to keep these people employed. I'm not saying that having people employed is a bad thing. I've worked in big organisations, and having money to pay people is what those organisations need. But having organisations which are not dependent upon funding is an immense strength, because you're not sidetracked. We didn't have to furlough anyone, for example, during 2020. We could just get on with it. And as people said, in many ways, the virus has been quite helpful. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but it has been quite helpful in terms of the sorts of things that we've been doing. Where we are at the moment in terms of our membership, our contact list, our aim is try and have about 1,000 people by the end of this year. And that's made up so far in terms of about 250 odd people who are on our newsletter list. So we put a newsletter every couple of weeks, telling people what's been going on. And obviously we've been spreading word about the ecological emergency strategy and so on as part of that recently. We've got a Facebook group, which we set up 2-3 years ago, I suppose. There's about 700 plus people on that. And there's an Instagram group, which we set up in May of this year, which has got about 150, 160 people on it. So we're reaching out to quite a lot of people, and we've only just started. There'll be more people by the end of today. And as I say, hopefully if I can get these 3 students going, we'll be walking around in North Bristol too. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful, Ben. Thank you so much. And the power of empowerment comes across very strongly, and the power of the collective in the community too. So thank you so much for sharing your stories. Something that strikes me as an opportunity here is also potentially to research the benefits around health and well-being as you grow that community and grow potentially the areas of rewilding. So perhaps that's something for Yui to think about engaging on. I know that Yui, you're actively involved already on the future parks work, and Sander Ismail is very much involved in that. We've now got just over 10 minutes left. So as those that have joined the conversation today, please do use the chat room at the bottom of your webinar, which on my screen is certainly at the bottom, the Q&A section, to ask questions of the panel. I can put those forward to the panel so that they can respond. Whilst we're waiting for questions to come in, Ian, I've got a question really around how do we accelerate this response, here in this region to increasing our habitats and biodiversity quickly in 10 years? What are the immediate things we need to do now and next?
Well, it's already happening actually. The Ecological Emergency Declaration has accelerated things in the way that we were hoping it would. So Bristol City Council are looking intently at how they use pesticides, how they grow, how they mow the verges. We talk. I think it was Ben who was talking about amenity grassland and how much better for wildlife it is if it grows a bit longer. So we're looking at those things. There's a whole conversation going on about what it means for housing and development and everything else going across the city. And there's a similar conversation going on in Bath as well, where they've also declared a nature emergency. So I think just the fact that we are increasing the focus and getting the local focus helps in itself. There's quite a lot going on nationally as well. There's an environment bill going through Parliament at the moment, which is setting requirements for local authorities to have local nature recovery strategies. It's providing tools to help with that. And we're just about on the threshold of more private investment coming through to create habitats for carbon offsetting, but also the biodiversity net gain requirements of the Environment Bill. And that means that where people are building new houses or new developments, they'll have to more than put back the value of any wildlife impact that they've had. So we're at quite an exciting time actually, where I think the realization is there of the scale of the problem, but there's also some of the tools coming through that have been talked about for years. So we will hopefully start to see some of that hitting the ground. But I also love what Ben said actually about you know, the power of just getting on with it and the ability of local communities just to get on with it, because that's one of the key themes of the ecological emergency strategy in Bristol, is that target of 30% of land managed for nature. That includes people's gardens, that includes community green space, it includes parks, allotments. So, you know, anyone who's got a piece of land, or even if it's a window box, can plant wildflowers, pollinator friendly plants, and really help to create that whole city for wildlife, as well as the large scale council and government and charity works that we're all involved in.
Thanks, Ian. Transport is one of the biggest contributors to poor health, as we know, you know, poor air quality, the noise pollution. And obviously with the pandemic, we've seen, you know, we saw a period of time, a significant drop in transport, and we're still seeing our streets modified to facilitate, obviously, social distancing. Selina, I just wondered what you see around the opportunity, you know, in terms of nature corridors and health benefits. Are we doing enough?
I think there are real opportunities to think about our cycle and walking routes as green corridors and not just transport corridors. And I think the description earlier that Ross gave of the green canopied route into Plymouth that's covered with trees, that it de facto is a wildlife corridor that allows people to cycle and walk along it, is a perfect example. So I think we do, and we have, you know, worked with Sustrans and so on, but I do think, and also that walking and cycling then allows people to actually engage with nature, to hear the birds, to notice the flowers. You know, cars just cut us off completely from our environment. So I think getting people out of their cars and onto those walking and cycling routes locally is a really good way of helping people understand what they've got and what's around.
Thanks, Selina. And one of the questions come through, which I can sort of partly answer, but I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it to you to also answer, probably, Selina. In the context of housing, what can be done through planning or local policy to drive this urgent change? What is happening to give reasons to be hopeful? And I'm thinking here, really, I think Ian sort of partly answered it around the Bristol City Council, but in terms of West of England Combined Authority, what progress is being made at this point in time?
Well, within the West of England now, we have a green infrastructure strategy. So that's very much clearly setting out that green infrastructure is not a kind of optional, nice to have extra, that it really is absolutely integral to the whole planning process, and trying to put that green infrastructure on a similar par to transport and other infrastructure requirements. So I think a number of members from the Nature Partnership have been heavily involved in that work. WECA has taken the lead and now own that. So I think that's a very important route forward. I think we do need to embed clear standards for access to green space into our developments, and it has to be high quality green space and it has to be accessible.
Thanks, Selina. I 100% agree. I also think that one of the findings from Nature Connectedness was around, and I'm just looking at this so I can read it, was around public service providers should make every waiting area from doctors' surgeries to bus stops a place where people can notice the good things about the natural world, move beyond access to parks, nature reserves, national parks to meaningful everyday engagement with nature on your doorstep. So I'll leave you with that as a thought. Before, we've just got a few more minutes before we start closing the session, and I just wanted to leave the panelists free to see whether there was anything, a particular point that you'd like to pick up on that you've heard others talk about today, and if so, wave at me. Ben.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that Ian said, and then Selina. I'm very pleased to hear that park officers are beginning to be more amenable. I mean, my experience of them is that they're very much supportive of what we've been talking about, but the thing that's held them back has been largely expenditure. I remember a year or so ago, we were talking to park officers. We wanted to set up a pond in one of the parks, and basically the answer was no, because long-term costs of maintenance and so on and so forth. If we can get over those sorts of things, then we can begin to make our parks more wildlife friendly, as well as providing the sorts of services that they also provide for children or footballers or whatever. So that's a sort of good development. The other thing to mention is about walking, which Selina mentioned. again, city council officers are beginning to talk about things like low traffic neighbourhoods or healthy neighbourhoods, as they're called in London. We need to encourage that sort of thing, where the idea that the car is the only thing that's important and everything else must take second place. We need to move on from that so that we live in places where not just animals can breathe clearly, but we can breathe nicely too.
Great, thank you, Ben. I'm conscious of time, and there's two fabulous questions that have come in, or really that are provocative in their thinking. One is from Pepper Barney saying, we're private tenants and choose to rewild our garden. Landlords have threatened our tenancy as a garden was not appropriate, despite our town declaring an ecological emergency. Given how many people rent privately, is there scope to protect their gardening choices? And I think whilst we as a panel may not have an answer for that, I think it's a really good ask and something that we can take away and need to think about in order to respond in this town to the in this city to this ecological emergency. I don't know whether Ian, you want to pick up or comment on that.
No, it's a really good point. I mean, I'm glad Pepper's rewilding her garden, and I'm sorry to hear that landlords have got a problem with that. I mean, I think one of the things we need to do is just normalise the joyous abundance of wildlife. You know, the idea that a closely cropped lawn and well-trimmed hedges are what we should be aiming for, I think we need to consign to the history books. We need to have wild, messy habitats with abundant wildlife. That's much better for everybody.
Great, thanks, Ian. Another related point from Mark Pendry, who says, bringing more people into contact with nature can have great benefits, but can adversely impact on the quality of the wildlife present. How can we manage this conflict? So this is a question of balance. So Ian, that might be you again, I'm afraid.
I was going to suggest Savita, actually.
Okay, Savita, yeah. Absolutely.
I think this is something that we've faced with running a lot of public engagement events, where there's been a concern from some land managers that, you know, the children will come and trample everything, and you know, it doesn't tend to happen. And I think maybe, you know, to end with the great David Attenborough, you know, we're not going to save what we don't understand, and we're not going to understand what we don't go and visit. I'm paraphrasing Sir David. But I do think that the opportunity to access, to see, to experience will outweigh, and I think people will always surprise us in good ways as well as bad.
Thanks, Savita. So it is now time, sadly, to draw this conversation to a close. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for fantastic content and taking the time to share your expertise and your stories today. It's been really enlightening. And I'm certainly going to leave us thinking about there's no well-being without nature's well-being as the thought from today. Following today, we will be, with all of the participants that have joined the conversation, we will be following up with an email. We'll be sharing useful links to some of the things that individuals have talked about today. And the Bristol Housing Festival is continuing to run on now for the next 10 days. So do have a look on their website to see what else you'd like to enjoy and take part of. And I'm sure that we will follow up and have more conversations to see how we can influence the housing sector and make sure that we create healthy, livable neighbourhoods for the future. So thank you very much for today. I'm now going to draw this session to a close. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.